Normandy, July 1944. The air trembles with the crackle of artillery and the low growl of tank engines hidden beyond the hedgerows. Morning mist clings to the fields, a gray shroud over the shattered French countryside. On a ridge above the village of Saint-Lô, a group of German officers watches through field glasses. Below them, a column of American Shermans crawls forward. Their olive-drab hulls glisten with dew, their engines rumbling with cautious determination. One officer smirks. "Sherman," he mutters to his aide, the word dripping with contempt. To them, these were amateur machines, soft-skinned, undergunned, good only for dying in numbers. The Tigers and Panthers behind them, blackened by soot and battle, stood as proof of German engineering supremacy. But then, a flash. From behind a hedgerow, an American tank fires. The crack of a new gun echoes across the valley. The shell punches through the side of a Panzer IV, erupting in a bloom of flame. The laughter on the ridge dies in an instant. The 76mm Sherman had arrived, and with it, the beginning of the end for German tank dominance. The road to that moment began years earlier, in the dust and heat of North Africa. When American forces first entered the war in late 1942, their tanks were new to battle. The M4 Sherman rolled off ships in Algiers and Casablanca, a machine of compromise, reliable, mobile, and easy to build. Its rounded turret, cast steel hull, and 75mm gun were born of lessons from France's collapse and Britain's struggles in the desert. At first it performed well. Against the German Panzer III and early Panzer IV, the Sherman was capable and often victorious. Its stabilizer system allowed for faster firing on the move, and its mechanical reliability made it beloved by crews compared to British or Soviet designs that often broke down under strain. But as 1943 bled into 1944, the balance shifted. The Germans unveiled the Panther and Tiger, tanks whose thick armor and high-velocity 75mm and 88mm guns could destroy a Sherman before it even reached effective range. In Tunisia, then Sicily and Italy, American tank crews learned this the hard way. A Sherman's 75mm shell could bounce harmlessly off a Panther's frontal armor, while the German guns could slice through a Sherman from over 1,500 meters. The battlefield statistics were grim. For every German Tiger destroyed, several Shermans were lost. Yet the U.S. Army didn't panic. Its doctrine was built not on duels of armor, but on combined arms warfare, tanks, artillery, infantry, and air power working as one. The Sherman was never meant to fight tanks head-on. Its mission was to exploit breakthroughs, support infantry, and keep moving. This philosophy came from experience and from logistics. The U.S. could produce thousands of Shermans each month, while Germany struggled to maintain a few hundred Panthers due to complex designs and Allied bombing. U.S. generals believed mobility and numbers would overwhelm quality. But on the ground, the men inside the Shermans had a different view. They were the ones watching their shells ricochet off German armor, the ones trapped inside thin steel coffins when return fire struck. They began calling their tanks Ronsons, like the cigarette lighter, because they lit up every time. Reports flowed back to Washington and Detroit. Crews demanded better guns, thicker armor, anything to survive a few more seconds in combat. But design changes took time. U.S. factories were already geared to produce tens of thousands of Shermans with the 75mm M3 gun. Changing that meant halting production lines, a risk military planners hesitated to take. Meanwhile, in Europe, intelligence reports revealed that German tank development wasn't slowing down. The Panther, though plagued with early mechanical issues, was proving deadly when deployed in numbers. The Tiger, while rare, terrified Allied troops wherever it appeared. The psychological gap widened. German officers mocked the American tanks as children's toys. Even Allied soldiers joked bitterly about their chances against the new armor. But in research centers across the United States, the Ordnance Department was already working on an answer, a new gun that could pierce German armor at range. Engineers at the Watervliet Arsenal and Aberdeen Proving Ground began testing prototypes of a new 76mm cannon derived from the anti-aircraft M3 gun. The idea was simple: give the Sherman a sharper bite. Yet the transition wouldn't be easy. Commanders debated whether the heavier gun would compromise the tank's stability or reliability. Some believed that mobility, not firepower, still defined victory. Others argued that without a weapon capable of defeating German armor, Allied crews would pay the price in blood. By the end of 1943, the debate reached Eisenhower's desk. The decision was made, quietly, decisively, to begin limited production of a new model, the M4A1 76W Sherman. As these new tanks rolled off assembly lines, few realized how critical their role would become. In the coming summer, on the beaches and bocage of Normandy, they would meet the enemy face to face, and the world would see whether American adaptation could stand against German engineering. The stage was set for a transformation in armored warfare. The next step, the long-awaited arrival of the 76mm gun itself. By the winter of 1943, the United States Army had learned a hard lesson. Doctrine could not protect a tank crew from an armor-piercing shell. The calls for more firepower had become impossible to ignore. In factories from Michigan to Pennsylvania, engineers worked under fluorescent lights, sketching and testing, searching for a solution that could fit within the Sherman's existing turret. The result was the 76mm M1 gun, a weapon longer, heavier, and far more powerful than the familiar 75mm. On paper, its performance was promising. At 1,000 meters, the 76mm could penetrate 109 millimeters of armor with standard ammunition, enough to threaten a Panther's side armor or a Tiger's turret ring. Firing high-velocity armor-piercing rounds, its muzzle blast was deafening, a crack that echoed like a thunderclap across training ranges. But even as prototypes impressed on the test fields, acceptance within the ranks was slow. Many senior officers feared the new weapon's recoil and muzzle flash would betray tank positions in combat. Others believed that statistically, tanks destroyed more soft targets, trucks, bunkers, gun emplacements than enemy armor, and the 75mm high-explosive shells were better suited for that. The argument became a clash of philosophies. In the United States, mobility and firepower were seen as separate virtues, and the tank was meant to complement, not replace, anti-tank guns or aircraft. In Germany, the tank itself was a symbol of battlefield supremacy. Yet as reports from Europe grew more desperate, the balance of opinion began to shift. The new 76mm variant entered low-rate production. By early 1944, the M4A1 76W and M4A2 76W models began to reach the training grounds of the U.S. Army and Marines. Crews immediately noticed the difference. The longer barrel changed the tank's silhouette. Its firepower changed their confidence. Still, the transformation wasn't complete. When the Allies landed in Normandy in June 1944, the vast majority of American Shermans still carried the older 75mm gun. Out of over 2,000 tanks that came ashore during the first month, fewer than 100 were equipped with the new 76mm cannon. Logistics, supply timing, and the sheer inertia of mass production had kept the improved models from arriving in strength. This meant that in the hedgerows of Normandy, those narrow lanes bordered by centuries-old earth mounds, the first clashes were fought under brutal conditions. American tankers often couldn't even see their enemies until muzzle flashes appeared through the foliage. When they did, it was often too late. Panthers waited in ambush, holes hidden behind the hedges, their long 75mm guns ready. One hit, and a Sherman would burn. Crew survival depended on seconds. Seconds to bail out, seconds to fire smoke shells, seconds to pray that infantry or air support could intervene. But as July approached, shipments of the new 76mm armed Shermans began arriving through Cherbourg. The tide, slowly, began to turn. Tank battalions started to receive mixed companies, half 75mm, half 76mm. The differences were subtle but meaningful. The men noticed how the new gun's projectile flew straighter, how it cracked armor that once seemed untouchable. Against Panthers caught in the flank, the 76mm could kill with one well-placed shot. Against Panzer IVs, it dominated completely. German intelligence first noticed the change in July 1944. Reports from the Western Front mentioned a new American gun capable of piercing medium tank armor. Yet for many German officers, this was dismissed as Allied propaganda. The belief in German technical superiority was near religious, the kind of arrogance that blinds an army in its final phase. At headquarters, behind the front, the laughter continued. They believed the Americans were still the same, clumsy, inexperienced, wasteful in men and machines. But on the ground, the battlefield was changing. Sherman crews were learning fast, using speed, coordination, and artillery to mask their moves. They began engaging at angles, exploiting terrain, and coordinating with fighter bombers that prowled overhead. The 76mm didn't make the Sherman invincible, but it gave its crews a fighting chance and a weapon that finally matched their courage. The summer of 1944 would become a proving ground for that courage as new Shermans with the long-barreled 76mm M1 gun rolled into battle through Normandy's deadly hedgerows, facing the most feared tanks of the war. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would rewrite the perception of American armor forever. The laughter of German officers was about to meet American steel and fire.
The battlefield is more than machines and steel. It's the sum of human endurance, tactical thought, and technological will. To understand how the tide turned, we must see it through several lenses, through the eyes of those who fought, those who commanded, and those who built the tools of war. 1. The human angle, inside the Sherman. For the American tank crew, the world was 4 inches of armor and a heartbeat's worth of chance. Inside a Sherman, space was suffocating. Metal walls lined with ammunition racks, the stench of oil, sweat, and cordite filling the air. The engine's constant vibration was their companion, the metallic echo of a gun breach their only defense. A typical crew, 5 men, commander, gunner, loader, driver, and assistant driver. Many were barely in their 20s, mechanics or farm boys who'd never seen a tank before 1942. Their training was short, their experience measured in weeks. When they faced German tanks in Normandy, they faced veterans, men who'd fought since Poland or Russia, driving Tigers and Panthers built for killing at range. For Sherman crews, survival depended on teamwork, the gunner's calm precision under fire, the loader's speed, the driver's nerve. They fought not for glory, but for each other, and the hope that the next hit wouldn't ignite the tank's fuel. Letters home tell the story best. A tank commander from the 2nd Armored Division wrote to his wife, "When they hit us, it's like someone kicked the air out of the world. You don't think about dying, you just move. Load, aim, fire, move again." When the 76mm armed Shermans began arriving,
Morale shifted. The crews finally had a weapon they could trust, one that could answer back. The psychological weight lifted. Their odds improved, if only slightly. To the men in the turrets, that difference meant everything. 2. The technological angle, the bite of the 76mm. The difference between the old 75mm and the new 76mm was more than a few millimeters of steel. It was the line between impotence and hope. The M1 76mm gun had a barrel nearly 4 feet longer than its predecessor. Its muzzle velocity reached 792 meters per second, enough to punch through most medium armor of the time. It fired new types of ammunition: APC-BC, armor-piercing capped ballistic cap, and HVAP, high-velocity armor-piercing rounds with tungsten cores. With HVAP rounds, a Sherman could finally penetrate the Panther's frontal armor at closer ranges, 800 to 1,000 meters. Against Tigers, the flanks were still vulnerable, and tactics evolved accordingly. The gun's recoil was violent, its flash blinding, but its effect was undeniable. Crews reported that after the first few engagements, the enemy no longer closed in with impunity. The new weapon also came with improved fire control, better optics, a refined gun mount, and a faster turret rotation thanks to hydraulic systems. Though still not as precise as the German Zeiss sights, American gunners compensated with superior coordination and volume of fire. In short, the 76mm gave the Sherman a new role, not just a support vehicle, but a tank killer in its own right. 3. The leadership angle, debate and doctrine. Behind every battlefield innovation lies a struggle within headquarters. The U.S. Army's armored doctrine was shaped by men like General Leslie McNair, who believed tanks were for exploitation, not direct combat against other tanks. The anti-tank role, in his vision, belonged to separate units, armed with towed guns or tank destroyers. This belief influenced every decision, from production priorities to tactical planning. The Sherman was thus designed to be reliable, fast, and versatile, not necessarily superior in firepower. But as German armor advanced, voices within the ranks began to argue the doctrine had fallen behind reality. Generals like George S. Patton, who respected speed and mobility, also understood the need for lethal firepower. He famously remarked, "The Sherman may not be the best tank, but it is the best tank in numbers." The Ordnance Department pushed for change, often clashing with field commanders. Each improvement, wet ammunition storage, better armor slope, the 76mm gun, was a fight through layers of military bureaucracy. By 1944, the debate reached its breaking point. Eisenhower ordered that new production Shermans include the 76mm gun wherever possible. Patton, despite his love for maneuver warfare, quietly approved. The war was shifting, and so too had the mindset of the men leading it. 4. The German perception, underestimation. For the German High Command, Allied armor was a source of ridicule. Reports from the Eastern Front had made them arrogant. Soviet T-34s had once terrified them, but they adapted quickly with heavier, better-armed tanks. When the Americans entered the war, German officers assumed the pattern would repeat. The Sherman's early performance seemed to confirm their beliefs. Panzer battalions in Normandy recorded enemy armor easily destroyed, and radio logs captured officers joking about American coffins on tracks. But arrogance can be fatal. When the 76mm armed Shermans appeared, their improved lethality caught many by surprise. German crews who had once engaged at leisure suddenly faced opponents capable of returning accurate fire. More troubling for them was the sheer number of Allied tanks. For every Panther lost, several Shermans could appear in its place. Even the finest machines could not withstand the pressure of attrition forever. German tank aces like Michael Wittmann acknowledged this reality before their deaths. His ambush at Villers-Bocage showcased German superiority, but his destruction weeks later under waves of Allied armor and air attacks symbolized a new order emerging from the smoke. The laughter that began in contempt was fading, replaced by a grudging recognition that the Americans were learning faster than expected.
By the height of summer 1944, the war in Normandy had turned into a slow, grinding duel, not just of firepower, but of minds. How the Sherman was used mattered as much as what it carried. The new 76mm gun gave it bite, but the tactics that emerged around it gave it teeth. 5. The tactical angle. Fighting smarter, not harder. In the hedgerow country of Normandy, brute force meant death. Every field was a fortress, every road an ambush. The Germans had the terrain and the range. The Americans had to outthink them. Tank commanders learned fast. Instead of charging through open lanes, they began working with engineers to clear narrow paths through the bocage, using bulldozers and explosives to create gaps of surprise. Shermans would appear where the enemy least expected. They coordinated closely with infantry. GIs carrying bazookas and radios advanced alongside the tanks, pointing out hidden positions or spotting for snipers. Artillery fire, pre-planned and rapid, blanketed likely ambush zones before each movement. The 76mm armed Shermans changed how engagements unfolded. Commanders began pairing 75mm and 76mm tanks in the same platoon, one firing high-explosive rounds to flush out defenders, the other waiting for armor to appear. When a Panther showed itself, the 76mm gunner aimed for the thinner sides or lower hull, firing in quick bursts before shifting position. This was combined arms warfare in its purest form, not a contest of machines, but of synchronization. It was the American way of war, made lethal through coordination and overwhelming logistics. Air power completed the triad. The roar of P-47 Thunderbolts circling overhead gave every Sherman crew courage. A single radio call could summon rockets or bombs onto entrenched German armor. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't heroic, it was methodical destruction, and it worked. Slowly, through attrition and precision, the Allies began breaking through the German defensive belts. Operation Cobra would soon tear a hole wide enough to end the stalemate. 6. The industrial angle, the arsenal of democracy. Behind every Sherman rolling through France was a continent of factories that never slept. The United States had become what Roosevelt once called the arsenal of democracy, a phrase that was no longer rhetoric, but reality. By 1944, over 49,000 Shermans had been built. Assembly lines in Michigan, Illinois, and California operated 24 hours a day. Women riveters, machinists, and welders replaced the men who'd gone to war. Raw steel became armor plates, cast hulls, and the unmistakable rounded turrets of the M4. Germany, by contrast, was bleeding industry. Allied bombers struck ball-bearing plants, railways, and assembly lines. Panthers and Tigers, though superior individually, were complex and time-consuming to build. One Tiger took twice as long to produce as 3 Shermans. This disparity created a war of endurance that Germany could not win. For every tank it destroyed, 3 more landed on French shores the following week. The 76mm upgrade symbolized that same adaptability, a system capable of evolving mid-war without halting its own production. American engineering favored standardization, meaning new parts, new guns, and new armor could be integrated with minimal disruption. German engineers scoffed at the simplicity of American designs. They saw the Sherman as crude, but on the battlefield, simplicity meant reliability. Tanks that started in the cold, crossed rivers, and could be repaired by field mechanics using spare parts from any other M4. In the end, the Americans didn't win the tank war by making the best tank. They won it by making enough good tanks and by ensuring every one of them could fight another day. 7. The moral angle. Fire, fear, and resolve. The clash between Shermans and Panthers was more than steel against steel. It was a contest of nerves. Inside a Sherman, death could come without warning. German 88mm shells didn't just destroy, they erased. A direct hit could turn a tank into a torch in seconds. Crew members called it riding the coffin. But courage persisted.
Not the loud kind, but the quiet endurance of men who climbed back into another tank after watching their friends burn in the last one. There was no hatred of the enemy at first, only fear and respect. German tankers, too, were professionals, men trained in precision and patience. But as the war dragged on and towns turned to rubble, emotions hardened. By 1944, every engagement carried a sense of inevitability. Both sides knew the outcome of the war. Few knew how long they would live to see it. For the Americans, the arrival of the 76mm gun offered something intangible: hope. Crews began to feel they could survive. They could fight, not just endure. A sergeant from the 3rd Armored Division later recalled, "You didn't have to pray for an airstrike anymore. You could fight back. That's what the 76 gave us, a fighting chance." That morale shift mattered more than armor thickness or muzzle velocity. In every army, belief in one's equipment is half the battle won. As the Allies pushed beyond the hedgerows and the fields of Normandy gave way to open country, that belief became action, coordinated, relentless, unstoppable. By the end of July 1944, the 76mm Sherman had proven itself. It was no longer the amateur's tank. But its true test, the moment when German confidence finally cracked, was still to come. The next phase of the war would decide not only the fate of France, but the myth of German invincibility itself. The laughter on the ridge would soon turn to silence beneath the roar of American fire.
Normandy, July 25, 1944. The morning began with thunder, not from the sky, but from the earth itself. Allied artillery opened fire along a 25-mile front, shattering the stillness with over 3,000 guns. It was the prelude to Operation Cobra, the great breakout from the bocage. For 7 weeks, the Americans had been trapped in the hedgerows, strangled by German defenses, ambushed at every turn. Now, they would break the deadlock. The Shermans, once mocked, would lead the charge. As the artillery barrage lifted, waves of American bombers descended, carpeting German lines with bombs so dense that even hardened veterans faltered. When the dust settled, the fields were no longer green, but gray, a wasteland of smoke, shattered trees, and torn metal. And then, through the haze, came the tanks. The 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions advanced along the Saint-Lô-Perrier Road, their Shermans pushing through churned soil and broken fences. Among them rolled the new M4A1 76W, its long barrel pointing forward like a promise. The crews inside knew this was different. This wasn't another cautious advance. This was an assault meant to break Germany's western front. The Germans, remnants of the Panzerlehr Division and scattered SS units, were disoriented, but still dangerous. Many waited in ambush, their panthers camouflaged behind hedgerows. But this time, the Americans were ready. A company from the 67th Armored Regiment advancing near Hebecrevon was among the first to encounter resistance. Panthers opened fire from 1,200 meters, knocking out the lead Sherman in a single shot. But the 2nd and 3rd tanks, armed with 76mm guns, swung into position. Their gunners aimed for the flanks, short bursts of fire, methodical and calm. The first round missed. The second found its mark. A Panther's turret erupted in flame. The 3rd tank fired again, another German vehicle disabled. In minutes, the ambush had been reversed. For the first time in Normandy, American tanks had gone toe-to-toe with Panthers and won. Reports of the engagement reached battalion command within the hour. The message was terse but electrifying. 76mm effective. Recommend more immediately. That day, the front began to move. The Shermans, supported by infantry and fighter bombers, punched through what remained of the German line.
Villages fell one by one. The speed of the advance shocked even the Americans. Within 48 hours, the Wehrmacht's carefully arranged defensive grid had collapsed. Panther wrecks littered the roads. German supply lines, already stretched to breaking, could not respond. Captured prisoners, some veterans from the Eastern Front, spoke with disbelief. They had expected to repel another slow Allied push. Instead, they found themselves outflanked, bombed, and hunted by tanks that seemed to appear everywhere. The shift was not just material, it was psychological. German tankers had grown accustomed to dominance, to dictating the range and terms of every fight. Operation Cobra shattered that illusion. The Americans were faster, more coordinated, and now, thanks to the 76mm, just as deadly. The U.S. armor surged south toward Coutances, cutting through what remained of the Panzerlehr and SS Panzer units. The narrow lanes of Normandy, once the Germans' ally, now became their trap. Shermans with 76mm guns waited at crossroads, ambushing retreating armor, firing from unexpected angles. Each battle carried the same rhythm: a flash of fire, a plume of black smoke, the sharp crack of a gunner's call over the radio. Hit confirmed, target burning. For every Panther destroyed, morale climbed higher. For every wrecked Sherman replaced within days, German confidence eroded further. And at the heart of this new momentum was the lesson no German strategist had foreseen: American adaptation. This wasn't the same army that had landed at Omaha Beach 7 weeks earlier. It was now an organism of precision, artillery, armor, and air operating in harmony. The Shermans were no longer the weak link, but the hammer. By August 1st, Patton's newly activated Third Army roared into the breach. His tank columns swept through the gap like a flood, turning the breakout into a rout. French villages cheered from behind broken walls as columns of olive-drab armor rolled past. What began as a tactical success became a strategic disaster for Germany. The only proud panzer divisions, the pride of Hitler's war machine, were now being cut apart by the very army they had once mocked. The laughter of officers on the ridges of Normandy had long since gone silent. In its place came the realization that Germany was losing not just ground, but the war itself. But the climax of the armor duel was not yet over. In the fields near Falaise, and later in the forests of Belgium, the 76mm Sherman would meet the full fury of Germany's armored counterattack and prove, beyond doubt, that the tide had turned.
August 1944. The German army was collapsing across France. The breakout from Normandy had turned into a pursuit. Patton's armored columns advanced like a living tide, the thunder of Shermans echoing through towns that had been battlefields only days before. But in the retreating chaos, the Wehrmacht prepared one last stand, a desperate attempt to encircle the Allies at the Falaise pocket. It would be here that the 76mm Sherman proved, beyond question, that the amateur tankers of America had become masters of armored war. The countryside around Falaise was a killing ground. Wrecked vehicles littered the roads, twisted hulks of panzers, burned-out trucks, and abandoned wagons. The German 7th Army and remnants of the 5th Panzer Army were trapped in a tightening noose. From the north came the Canadians and Poles. From the south, the Americans. In between lay thousands of desperate German troops, the remaining tanks forming scattered rearguard positions. Among them were a handful of Panthers and Tigers, symbols of a dying empire, still capable of terrible resistance. On August 17th, units of the 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions began their push toward Chambois. Shermans advanced cautiously through shattered orchards and narrow lanes, their commanders scanning for the gleam of German armor. The air smelled of fuel and cordite, of the wreckage of men and machines. Then came the contact reports. Panther tanks ahead, east of St. Lambert. A platoon of M4A1 76W Shermans moved into position behind a ridge. Their commanders dismounted to scout, peering through binoculars over the rise. Beyond the hedgerows, 3 Panthers sat waiting, their guns aimed down the approach road. In the past, this would have been a death trap. Now, it was a duel. The lead Sherman reversed into a hull-down position, only the turret exposed. The gunner whispered distance and wind correction. The commander gave the order. Fire. The 76mm roared. The shell streaked across the field and slammed into the flank of the first Panther. A plume of fire erupted from the rear deck. Seconds later, the second Sherman fired. Another hit. The third Panther tried to pivot, but its track snapped under the strain. Within moments, all 3 were burning. The engagement lasted less than 2 minutes. The American tanks withdrew to reload, dust and smoke swirling around their turrets. Nearby infantry cheered. For the first time, they had watched Shermans destroy Panthers without the help of artillery or air power. The myth of German invincibility was dying before their eyes. As the pocket closed, the destruction was total. By August 22nd, over 10,000 German vehicles were destroyed or captured. The road to Chambois became a river of blackened armor. Allied tankers called it the Corridor of Death. Among the wrecks, American crews walked in silence, examining the remains of the machines that had once terrified them. They found shattered Tiger turrets, hulls split open by direct hits, and crews who'd never had a chance to escape. The air reeked of oil and ash. The 76mm Sherman had done what it was designed to do. It had met the best of German engineering and survived. But the story did not end in Normandy. As autumn came, the war pushed east into Belgium and the Ardennes, and there, amid snow and forest, came Germany's final gamble, the Battle of the Bulge. December 16th, 1944. The German counterattack struck like lightning. Armored spearheads led by King Tigers and Panthers smashed into thin Allied lines. Once again, Sherman crews faced enemies that outgunned and outweighed them. Yet now they were veterans, hardened by Normandy and the breakout. They fought with discipline, coordination, and the confidence that their weapons could deliver. In towns like Bastogne and Stant-Vith, the 76mm armed Shermans fought desperate holding actions, firing through snow and fog, often at ranges where seconds decided survival. In Clairvaux, an American platoon destroyed 5 German tanks before being overrun, their wrecks left behind like monuments of defiance. At Roquefort, a company of Shermans ambushed a column of Panthers emerging from a wooded road. The first 2 enemy tanks went up in flames before they could even return fire. The rest retreated under artillery bombardment. German prisoners, captured in the aftermath, spoke of surprise. Not at American numbers, but at their precision. They shoot fast, they move faster. It is not like before. That simple confession marked a turning point deeper than any map line could show. By the time the Bulge was broken in January 1945, the U.S. Army was no longer seen as the junior partner in the Allied coalition. It was now the spearhead, mobile, relentless, and armed with weapons that had proven their worth. The 76mm Sherman had gone from a stopgap design to the symbol of American adaptability, an instrument forged in adversity and perfected in battle. And across the ruined fields of France and Belgium, where tigers once ruled and laughter once echoed, silence now reigned, broken only by the distant rumble of engines moving east, toward Germany itself. The laughter had faded. The myth had burned. But war never ends with triumph alone. Its price is measured in the wreckage left behind. Next came the reckoning, the aftermath of fire, and the human cost buried beneath victory.
When the guns finally quieted over Normandy and the smoke settled across the Falaise plain, the landscape told its own story, one of steel, ash, and finality. Hundreds of tanks, American Shermans, German Panthers, Tigers, and countless lesser machines lay scattered across the countryside, burned out and rusting, mute witnesses to a war of attrition that had devoured everything in its path. The Allied victory was overwhelming, but it had come at a cost written in blood and iron. Between June and August 1944, more than 4,000 Allied tanks were destroyed or disabled in the push across Normandy. Many of them were Shermans, victims of mines, artillery, and the long, deadly barrels of German guns. But in that same period, the Wehrmacht lost more than 2,500 tanks and assault guns, irreplaceable losses for a nation already collapsing under the weight of its own industry. Numbers told a grim but undeniable truth. The Americans could replace what they lost. The Germans could not. Every Sherman burned in a Norman field could be replaced within weeks. Each new tank arrived fully supplied, crewed, and ready for battle. German replacements, by contrast, often incomplete. Tanks without engines, crews without fuel, divisions without cohesion. The arrival of the 76mm Sherman only amplified that imbalance. It was not the perfect tank, but it was the right tank, for the right army, at the right time. Its gun gave American crews confidence. Its reliability kept them moving. The U.S. Army's logistical machine ensured a constant flow of parts, ammunition, and fuel. Advantages so fundamental they became invisible. The German Army, for all its brilliance, had no answer for that kind of endurance. After the breakout from Normandy, the momentum never stopped. By September, American armor had reached the borders of Belgium. By October, the Rhine was within reach. Each mile was marked by the same rhythm, Shermans advancing, German armor falling back or burning. Captured reports revealed the shift in German perception. Panzer commanders, once contemptuous, began to describe American tanks with respect. A field report from the 12th SS Panzer Division in August 1944 read, "The new Sherman type with long gun is dangerous at medium distance. Side armor of Panther vulnerable. Crews must not underestimate enemy range or coordination." Those words, bureaucratic and restrained, carried the weight of reluctant acknowledgement. The enemy they had mocked was now the one forcing them into retreat. For the American crews, the cost was personal. The life expectancy of a Sherman tank in heavy combat was measured in weeks. Crews bonded fast, fought hard, and were often replaced as quickly as the tanks themselves. Letters home from Normandy and France spoke of exhaustion and disbelief. One driver from the 4th Armored Division wrote, "They told us we were fighting machines, but machines die too. You climb into a new one and pretend it's different, but the smell, the same smell, stays with you." Even in victory, the shadow of loss never left. By late 1944, the Sherman had become the backbone of the Allied advance into Western Europe. More than 11,000 were deployed across the continent. Some were still the 75mm variant, others carried the 76mm gun, and a growing number were modified to mount British 17-pounders, the fearsome Firefly variant, capable of piercing even the Tiger's frontal armor. Together, they formed an unstoppable tide. The battlefield that had once belonged to the Germans, a realm of technical mastery and elite weaponry, now belonged to the Americans and their allies. Industrial power, adaptation, and resilience outlasted perfection. But the greatest victory was not one of metal. It was the triumph of learning under fire. The U.S. Army, criticized for being slow to adapt, had proven that evolution could happen even in the midst of chaos. The guns of Operation Cobra and Falaise had opened the road to Germany, but the final test of the Sherman and of the 76mm gun still lay ahead in the heart of Europe, where the ruins of the Reich awaited. The war was ending, but its consequences were only beginning.
As the Allied armies advanced into Germany in early 1945, the Sherman, once dismissed as an inferior design, became the workhorse of the final campaign. Its silhouette, once mocked, now rolled across the Rhine, through shattered cities and burned-out forests, leading the way to victory. In the spring thaw, the rivers ran thick with the remnants of the Third Reich. Towns like Remagen, Cologne, and Nuremberg fell one after another, their defenses broken by artillery, airstrikes, and the steady advance of armor. Everywhere the Sherman was there, bridging rivers, supporting infantry, punching through the last lines of German resistance. By March, the German panzer divisions that had once terrified Allied crews were shadows of their former selves. Fuel shortages grounded entire battalions. Crews abandoned their tanks to fight on foot. The once proud Tiger and Panther formations were now little more than names in reports. When the 3rd Armored Division reached Cologne, one of the war's most famous tank duels occurred. A single German Panther positioned near the cathedral ambushed an American column. 2 Shermans were destroyed within seconds. But among the attackers was a 76mm Sherman, its crew veterans of Normandy. They maneuvered quickly through the debris-strewn streets, circling behind the Panther's field of fire. With a single shot, they pierced its side armor. Flames poured from the turret. The duel was captured on film by an army cameraman, an image that would come to symbolize the entire struggle. German precision versus American persistence. The message was unmistakable. The era of German superiority was over. In the aftermath of victory, the numbers told the final truth of the tank war in Europe. By May 1945, the Allies had lost nearly 20,000 tanks and armored vehicles in the Western theater. Germany had lost more than 45,000, and more critically, the ability to replace them. The U.S. had produced over 49,000 Shermans in just 3 years, a feat of industrial mobilization the world had never seen. For all its weaknesses, its thin armor, its tendency to burn when hit, its vulnerability to high-velocity guns, the Sherman had succeeded where it mattered most. It won the war it was built for. In post-war evaluations, even German officers admitted respect for the machine they had once scorned. General Heinz Guderian, father of Blitzkrieg, remarked that while the Panther and Tiger were technically superior, they were too few, too late. The Sherman, he said, was everywhere. That ubiquity was its genius, a tank that could be repaired in the field, produced in any factory, and shipped across oceans. A machine simple enough for mass production, yet adaptable enough to evolve. The 76mm gun, though never a perfect equal to the Tiger's 88mm, gave the Sherman just enough edge to survive. Its arrival marked the moment when American armor stopped enduring the war and started shaping its outcome. The crews who fought in them, though, carried scars deeper than statistics could show. Many never made it home. Those who did returned with memories of smoke, fire, and the metallic taste of survival. One gunner from the 2nd Armored Division recalled, "They said we were amateurs. Maybe we were. But by the end, we were still here, and our tanks were still rolling." That sentence, stripped of triumph, held the weight of everything the war had taught, that courage and adaptability could bridge the gap between design and destiny. When Germany finally surrendered on May 8, 1945, the Sherman stood parked on the ruins of Berlin, not as the best tank of the war, but as the one that mattered most. From the deserts of North Africa to the snows of the Ardennes, it had carried an army across continents and through evolution itself. What began as a compromise had become a symbol of unstoppable momentum, the embodiment of American industry, improvisation, and resolve. The laughter that had once echoed from German tank crews had long since died. In its place came silence,
the silence of recognition. The war was over, but its lessons were only beginning to shape the world that followed. The battlefield had fallen quiet, yet the legacy of the 76mm Sherman burned on, etched into every field where armor met armor, and the tide of history turned. In the end, the story of the 76mm Sherman is not of glory, but of growth. It is the story of an army that began the war uncertain, underestimated, and untested, but learned faster than any in modern history. Of young men who climbed into thin-skinned machines not because they believed them invincible, but because someone had to keep moving forward. The Sherman never pretended to be the best tank on the battlefield. It was simply enough, fast enough, reliable enough, and deadly enough when placed in the hands of men who refused to stop adapting. And that, more than anything, was the secret of Allied victory. The 76mm gun symbolized that evolution. It wasn't about power alone. It was about understanding, about taking the lessons carved into steel and flesh in North Africa, Sicily, and Normandy, and turning them into something that could meet the future head-on. German officers laughed once, confident that their superiority in engineering guaranteed victory. But war is rarely decided by perfection. It is decided by persistence. Every burning Sherman in Normandy became a lesson. Every lost crew a reason to improve. Each iteration of the tank, every retooled gun, every field modification, every faster reload, was a quiet defiance of that laughter. By 1945, those amateurs had become professionals in the truest sense, masters none of machines, but of adaptation itself. In the decades that followed, the lessons of the Sherman lived on. Future American tanks, the Pershing, the Patton, and eventually the Abrams, all carried its legacy: mobility, reliability, and the belief that technology serves strategy, not the other way around. In war, perfection is an illusion. Survival is the reality. And in that reality, the 76mm Sherman stood as proof that courage and innovation could turn a weapon of compromise into a weapon of victory. When the last engines fell silent in 1945, the laughter that had once followed American tankers across Europe had long since turned to respect. The kind earned not through fear, but through endurance.